In the United States, there's about 64 million Hispanics, and that represents about 20% of our population. So it's not a niche, little market somewhere. It's actually a mainstream market for any brand or any organization that wants clients, customers, or members or constituents. So that's one thing. And the other thing is go local. We find that in many zip codes, the in the last 10 years, 75% of the population growth has been from the Hispanic market. So you cannot ignore the market if you want to be sustainable as a brand, as an organization, as a credit union over the years. The other thing is, know that this is a very nuanced and complicated identity. So Hispanics in the United States, may have different cultural elements. The first one that jumps to everybody is the use of Spanish. We come from 20 plus countries in Latin America to the United States. And so there is not a unified identity of the Hispanic person in the United States. I come from Panama. Panama has very few immigrants here in the United States. But the vast majority are from Mexico. A Panamanian and a Mexican don't understand the world the same way. A Panamanian and a Mexican don't understand financial services, money, the same way. Every country, 20 plus, like I said, has an understanding and a worldview that differs from the other. You come to the United States, and then your identity isn't the same. So it's really important to understand the local market, to see if you have Puerto Ricans, to see if you have people with heritage of Bolivia or Chile or Argentina or Costa Rica or Honduras or Guatemala, because we don't understand the world the same way.
All right. Well, welcome to another great episode of the Credit Union Nation podcast. I'm Tom Saycash, your host, and I am so happy to have Victor Corro join me from Coopera Consulting. Thanks so much, Victor. I think, Victor, we speak Spanish to each other when we see each other. I'm not going to try to do it on the podcast, but I was actually a Spanish major. I don't know if I ever told you that. So I studied Spanish. I had my BA in Spanish, and there was a time when I was pretty fluent, I would say, in Spanish. But I only speak credit union now, I guess. So, so my Spanish is very out of practice. But either way, it's fantastic to see you. Thanks for joining. How are you doing today?
Likewise, I'm doing very well, Tom. Really gracious for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I know you're heading down to Panama to visit your family tomorrow. So looking forward to hearing how that trip goes. I hope you have some beautiful weather and can lay in a hammock and sit by the beach a little bit while you're down there.
I am so looking forward to doing that. Thanks.
Well, so Victor, you've been at Coopera for how many years now? How long have you been there as CEO?
Believe it or not, 8 years. It's been 8 years since I've been working here at Coopera. Yeah.
Wow, wow, wow. It's amazing how fast time flies. You and I, go way back, back at my time at the National Trade Association. But I do want to start with just hearing about your credit union journey and, hearing how you sort of made your way through this industry a little bit. So I thought that's where we could start. Would you mind sharing a little bit about, how you got into the credit union movement to begin with and kind of how you've made your way through it over the years?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I usually like to share with everyone is that actually my parents did start a teachers credit union in Panama. So when I was a teenager, I remember all the teachers coming to my house at night and, all this hubbub about it. And I go, I have no idea what this is. It was my parents, my mom and dad, starting a teachers credit union, obviously, because, they were not financially included, or they had barriers to financial inclusion, or, dealing with national banks and what have you. So they thought, well, opening a credit union may be a good thing for us teachers. Well, fast forward, a couple of years after that, I find myself studying at the University of Wisconsin through a Fulbright scholarship. So that's how I ended up in Wisconsin. And That's where I met my wife. And once you get married, you do need a job. And I happen to be in the
It's funny
medicine
how that happens,
area,
right?
right? Uh, and at that point, the World Council of Credit Unions was looking for a program specialist who's bilingual to help with their projects in Latin America. So in 1998, I was hired, as a program specialist for Latin America at the World Council of Credit Unions. And I did spend there 20 years of my, professional career, mainly working with credit unions outside of the United States, but also starting a partnership program between states in the United States, credit unions in, any given state,
Hmm.
and we paired them up with different countries, kind of like a sister city kind of structure in which, people share their knowledge and their love for the cooperative business model. So that's
Yeah.
how I got started in this. Yeah, and the rest, I guess, is history. I've, got to know the Iowa League very well, and that
Hmm.
was the origins of Coopera way back in 2006, I believe it was. And, one thing led to another after Woku. For the last 8 years, I've been here at Coopera Consulting.
Hmm. Hmm. I didn't realize that you had been working on sort of like that partner system with the leagues
Yeah,
and some of the international credit union communities. Because when I was working at the association, working for small credit unions, I would get a lot of requests from international credit unions looking for support. And because the majority of international credit unions are small, as you know,
right.
it always fell into my lap first, which was cool because I got to meet all these fantastic people from, outside of the US who were running credit
Yeah,
unions and kind of hear what their challenges were. And then oftentimes I would refer them to, the sister credit union league, that had sort of partnered up
yeah.
with that country. So I didn't know that's what was under your purview there. That's
Oh,
really cool.
yeah. At the height of it, we had 30 different partnerships between states in the United States and other countries. Obviously, I got to know Iowa very well because they were paired up with my country of origin, Panama.
Hmm.
And so,
Okay.
we had Ohio and Romania, we had like Connecticut and Trinidad and Tobago. This is how I got to know such wonderful people in the Korean system in the US and obviously internationally.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That must have been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So tell me a little bit about Coopera's journey. Where did this
Yeah.
organization start and where is it today?
Well, Coopera was founded in, like I said, in 2006, God, almost 20 years ago,
Hmm.
by the late Warren Morrow. And he was a
Hmm.
Hispanic community activist in Des Moines, Iowa. And, Coopera was focused initially in helping expand to the Hispanic market. So helping credit unions understand the Latino immigrant community mostly. That's what it was. So at that point, Warren got in contact with the Iowa Credit Union League, and the Iowa Credit Union League was obviously looking at the demographic information and data of the country and Iowa itself, and so that even back then, the fastest growing population or market segment within the United States is the Hispanic community. And so they thought, well, maybe we can build a business around this reality so that credit unions understand how to grow within this market, how to appeal with this market. And that's how Coopera was started. The name itself of Coopera, it's a Spanish word that means to cooperate. So it's a kind of like a nod to our business model of cooperation, financial cooperatives.
Hmm.
And, that's how kind of like everything started. Coopera now has almost 20 years of history. It's still owned by the Iowa Credit Union League, and it's now a nationwide network of clients and supporters and people that really work in this. We have actually gone beyond the Hispanic market and focus now on multicultural markets because that's the fastest growing again as a whole population
Hmm.
segment that are growing.
Hmm. Hmm. Have the services evolved over time? Like, how did it look? Like, what was the main sort of service that Coopera offered when it first started out, and then what do you guys do now? Like, what are the sort of the
Right.
main buckets of service that you provide credit unions?
Yeah, essentially the business model has remained pretty similar, but we have been adding more and more layers of services and basically data.
Hmm.
So the one thing that we want our clients or our credit unions to understand is, first of all, their the markets and who's growing within what market and what market segments they may be leaving behind
Mm-hmm.
in terms of growth or in terms of financial inclusion or even awareness. So who's within your market, who you're leaving behind is one of the questions. And for that, we have something that is called an ethnicity segmentation analysis.
Hmm.
Then the other thing would be, a target market analysis. If you want to grow as a credit union, these are the sub-markets that you need to understand within the very complicated and complex, say the Hispanic market, which is not a monolith.
Hmm.
What market segments
Which
you need
which
to
we'll get
focus
into. Which we'll get into.
on. Right.
Yes.
We'll
Yeah.
get into that. The other thing, and this is fundamental, is also the internal disposition of the organization to serve any given market and what
Mm,
kinds of biases we may have, what kind of mental barriers you may have to that,
mm,
uh, to those markets. If we think that a market is, low income, poor, and high risk, we have less of an inclination to serve it in a certain way. And so we need to really determine the culture internally of the organization and shift it and change it so that they think that, we're here for growth, not for charity, not for help those people. So that's something that, we really work with the organizations to ensure that they understand that there's a solid business case for all of this. And from there, we have added things as, training, we have added things as demographic studies. We do this with leagues. And we actually work with other clients that may not necessarily be credit unions. So first of all, is, the buckets are data, coaching and consulting, and then, being an accountability partner so that people keep doing the work.
hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great. Um, as you think about Coopera's mission, and I
Hmm.
know that now you've sort of branched out into being more sort of focus on multicultural, so not just exclusively the Hispanic market.
Right.
But as you think about the work of the organization, what are the goals? Like, if you could see the credit union movement evolve over the next 10 years, and that Coopera was a big part of sort of shaping, how credit unions think about serving a multicultural
Hmm.
consumer. Like what would you like to see the industry look like in 10 years after you have your fingerprints on it?
Yeah. Well, certainly an engine for growth, but
Hmm.
growth not towards just becoming a bigger financial institution. It's really activating the philosophy or the principles that exist behind a cooperative business model.
Hmm.
A financial cooperative is supposed to really help people in, first of all, removing barriers to financial inclusion, but
Hmm.
then once those barriers are removed and you become a member, help that consumer elevate their financial standing, financial health and well-being. So
Hmm.
the first thing is, being an engine of awareness for consumers to see credit unions as a place to do their banking, but then, make the consumer understand that that place is there for financial health and well-being. How do we accumulate wealth? How we invest better? How do we avoid living paycheck to paycheck? Or how we, save for emergencies? All that kind of thing. And so if you think of the cooperative principles, that really helps. So that's kind of like the goal of Coopera, to really activate and help financial institutions to leverage, especially credit unions, that philosophy that exists out there.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you and I went to. I'm just remembering. You and I went to DE together.
Yes.
We
The
had a
best class
very
ever,
star.
right?
Yeah,
2017
yeah. I always make the
fall.
joke like you guys think you're the best class ever, but we literally had the best class ever,
We
and
did.
it was like the most star-studded class. I feel like everybody
Mhm.
in that program. I feel like has had an outsized significant influence on the industry. Maybe beside myself. I'll exclude myself from that from that category.
Now you should be there.
Um, but it was really amazing. Like one day we'll have to like publish a list of all the people who were in that class. It was really amazing.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of overlap and alignment with what you were just talking about with the things that you learn about in DE. And so curious to
Hmm.
know your thoughts about your experience in DE and do you feel like DE fueled what the work that you were already doing or that you wanted to continue to do at Coopera? Um, well, at that time, let's see, we went through in 2017. So
17.
this was right before you went to Coopera.
Hmm.
So after going through DE, do you feel like when you saw what Coopera was doing and that you had the opportunity to work for that, were you like, okay, this is my chance to sort of build on everything that I did at DE, or like, where does DE sort of fit into your career and how you think about credit unions?
I would say provide a really a common language to really talk about, this passion or this love that you have for something that you do.
Mhm.
At that point, I had been working 20 years with credit unions, and you see the good that they can do in communities,
Hmm.
but never really saw it from the perspective of American credit unions because I was mostly working with, overseas credit unions or international credit unions, and
Hmm.
so DE really, you know. Give me that way to articulate, oh, I really care for this cooperative business model. I really care for what these community-based organizations can do for the consumer. So it really provided some sort of clarity to the work that I was already doing. So and yeah, it was a start studied class, and the I think it was the last time that Lois Kitch actually was the mentor and all of this in here in the US. So it was a pretty special time and something that I will never forget. And and that continues, obviously, all that camaraderie, all that network that it provided. It's people that I'm still working with to this day, almost 10 years later. So
Yeah,
that was a really
yeah,
special time.
yeah. It really was. It really was. And I feel like um, there are so many people who like just did different things too, and who came
Hmm.
from so many different walks of life. Like we had George, Abado was my mentor,
Right.
and like you don't appreciate like I didn't know much about the industry. I was pretty new to CUNA then. I think I'd
Hmm.
only been working there for a couple of years.
Right.
And I wasn't as exposed to the international credit union movement.
Hmm.
And you really get that, or at least we got that in our class. I don't know if that's true for all DE classes, but our class definitely had sort of an international flavor to it, partly
Right.
because of George, but also because of Lois too, who
Yeah.
was so involved in the international DE community. And then like as my career went on and I spent more time at GAC and
Yeah.
just sort of like saw the full industry, like you see George and his influence and like the way that people would approach him, when you'd see him in
Hmm.
public with just like this reverence and
Yeah.
like he's just sort of this larger than life figure. I always felt like I was like not I always felt like I was gonna like disappoint George in some way, like I mean he's this guy who has made such a huge impact in an entire
Yeah.
continent.
Right.
It's like like oh my God, I'm so small pickings compared to this guy, but he was also like just so personable and so supportive, and like I remember some like individual conversations that I had with him when he was my mentor,
Yeah.
and he was just like a great mentor for sure. Wow, what a wonderful
Right.
guy. Yeah,
And see, that provided such a great network, again, that we still leverage, you and I, in
yeah,
different ways.
yeah,
And so that's what that program is so important to, focus ourselves on what is the why of the industry. So, that was a big takeaway from that. But then being able to just, text somebody from that class, and, that almost happened almost 8 years ago, or whatever it was. And
Hmm.
yeah, here we are working together still.
Yeah. Yep. Still here. That's right. Okay, so I wanted to dive into the Hispanic
Mhm.
market in
Yeah.
particular, even though Coopera's focus has shifted to being more generally multicultural. You and I have had some conversations. It started at this past year's GAC,
Yeah.
where you did a presentation
For inclusive.
at it was at an inclusive roundtable,
Right.
and you talked about the Hispanic population and how, that it's important that we shift our thinking about how we serve that group. And that, as you
Hmm.
said during this podcast, it's not a monolith. It's much
Hmm.
more dynamic. It's much more heterogeneous
Yeah.
than I think we sort of give it credit for. And then, I think the other thing is sort of the diversity within the Hispanic market,
Right.
right? It's not one nationality or one ethnicity. It's a
Right.
much more broad spectrum than that. And I
Correct.
think I think those are things that, we as an industry, we as a society, or as a country take for granted a little bit.
Hmm.
And I think that mentality limits probably our ability to serve these groups effectively and well, right? And resonate with
Hmm.
them. And so this is a big subject, and I know you have a lot to
Right.
say on it, but I just thought I would just sort of set the stage a little bit that, what is your thinking on sort of the current ways that credit unions should be thinking about that
Right.
market, and what is some of the advice that you would give around how
Yeah.
to think about that market?
Well, the first thing that I would say is just foster curiosity internally at the credit unions and really, do a deep dive into the Hispanic community. In the United States, there's about 64 million Hispanics, and that represents about 20% of our population. So it's not a niche, little market somewhere. It's actually a mainstream market for any brand or any organization that wants clients, customers, or members or constituents. So
Hmm.
that's one thing. And the other thing is go local. We find that in many zip codes, the in the last 10 years, 75% of the population growth has been from the Hispanic market. So you cannot ignore the market if you want to be sustainable as a brand, as an organization, as a credit union over the years. The other thing is, know that this is a very nuanced and complicated identity. So Hispanics in the United States, may have different cultural elements. The first one that jumps to everybody is the use of Spanish. You know, uh, we come from 20 plus countries in Latin America to the United States. And so there is not a unified identity of the Hispanic person in the United States. I come from Panama. Panama has very few immigrants, here in the United States.
Hmm.
But the vast majority are from Mexico. A Panamanian and a Mexican don't understand the world the same way. A Panamanian and a Mexican don't understand financial services, money the same way. Every country, 20 plus, like I said, has an understanding and a worldview that differs from the other. You come to the United States, and then your identity isn't the same. So it's really important to understand the local market to see if you have Puerto Ricans, to see if you have people with a heritage of Bolivia or Chile or Argentina or Costa Rica or Honduras or Guatemala, because we don't understand the world the same way. The other thing is not to assume that because you have a Hispanic or Spanish surname or last name, automatically you speak Spanish. The vast majority of the Hispanic in the United States are actually very fluent in English. If not, they prefer English and don't speak any Spanish. That's one of the things that we need Koreans to be very aware of. Let's say that you're gonna go market to the Hispanic market, and then you start with things that are just in Spanish. But the vast majority of your Hispanics actually don't speak Spanish. You're actually alienating the market by assuming things about them. So this is why data is so important to understand, what generation they're in, what is their language preference, what is their country of origin, what is their level of income and education and all of these things. It's a very complex, identity. It's a very complex consumer to understand.
I think that from our perspective at Y Cup and when we were working with credit unions who are interested in
Hmm.
serving the Hispanic market, we write grants for credit unions who want to who want to translate documents and loan forms into
Yeah.
Spanish, who want to provide financial education in Spanish. I think we're even guilty of thinking about the Hispanic market
Hmm.
as this homogenous monolithic group. And I think that's why your message is so important because it's evidence that that's just not the case. And I
Right.
think the thing that blew me away the most when we talked about this last week was the English part, because the sort of the conventional wisdom was if you want to serve the Hispanic market, you have to hire someone who's from that community who speaks Spanish so that you can you can communicate with these Spanish only
Hmm.
speaking folks. You have to translate your loan forms, your marketing materials so that they can understand what you're providing as a financial institution. But the fact is, the vast majority, as you're saying, don't just speak Spanish or don't even speak Spanish at all,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And I think that that was really eye-opening for me. And so,
Hmm.
as you think about how credit unions should interpret that and take that message in, and then rethink how they think about that demographic and that market,
Hmm.
what are the things that they should be doing in order to resonate with that group and show that they're culturally um, accepting and want to serve
Right.
them, um, but do so in a way that actually makes sense to how they sort of live their
Yeah.
lives in this country. Yeah.
So, it's complex, but it requires a commitment from the Korean to really understand the market, and this is what big brands in the United States are doing. Apple is doing market research, GM is doing market research, Amazon certainly is doing market research. How to appeal to a market that is complex? And the first thing is, again, doing that market research. If you find, for instance, that your actual members are, what is their language preference if it comes to Asian consumers or Hispanic consumers? I can give you examples of the Koreans that we work with. Usually, people who are dependent or Spanish preferring completely no English at all is about 2% to 5% of the membership of that credit union. People who
Mm-hmm.
are bilingual, bicultural, they have different degrees of English fluency, is usually more than 75% of the credit union.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, there is a 2% to probably 10% of that of your membership that is struggling with that barrier of English because they don't speak it. So yes, it behooves the credit union to have some capacity to, talk to a member in Spanish. But that member is conditioned to understand that that experience is not going to be optimal and equal to an English experience. So the credit union can forgive itself or have some grace to itself to say, you know what, we need to put a band-aid to this, but just signal to that consumer that we care about them and we're doing something for them. And
Mm-hmm.
over time, things would get better as you add bilingual capability, bilingual staff, start translating things. It's not like overnight this is going to happen and the consumer understands that. The other thing is if you find that the credit union only have 2% Spanish speakers or Spanish dependent speakers who happen to be Hispanic, we need to compare that to the community. If we find that the community is 90% Spanish speakers and the credit union is only attracting 2% Spanish speakers, we know that there's a gap there.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
most communities in the United States, we find that, already the Hispanic market is bilingual, bicultural. Again, more than 50% already speaks English and understands money in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So having that data clear is going to really help the brand.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have, again, only 2% of your membership and 2% of your community speak Spanish, you don't really need to have the urgency to have things in Spanish.
Right.
And that's what's happening. I think to the beginning of your question, we always have treated, I shouldn't say always, we have usually treated the Hispanic market as a market that needs help, underserved, unbanked, low income. That comes from our, philosophy and our principles of opening up and provide financial inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you have to balance that with growth. And data lets you know that. What people are financially excluded, why people are financially excluded, not because of barriers, it because of other or culture. Why are they excluded? Just because there is not a convenient credit union by them, but they don't have any issue with the language. So we really to understand why people are financially excluded. It's not always because of language or culture.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then I know you also, at your presentation at GAC, you talked about some
Hmm.
messaging or sort
Yeah,
of a way of thinking about the opportunity. So not only, understanding what's actually happening on the ground in the Hispanic market, but also how you think about them from a growth opportunity.
right.
There's such a better way to think about that group. And for us and for me personally,
Yeah,
when I think about credit unions, obviously we want them to grow. We want our clients to grow because growth gives them the capacity to make greater
right,
investments and make a deeper impact. But ultimately, for me, what I want to see credit unions do is help people, and
right.
make an impact on the individual and on the family's life, right? So that's, I caveat all this by saying that
Yeah,
that's what's important to me. That being said, credit unions are thinking about their bottom line, and they're thinking about the
right.
places where they still have opportunities for growth. And that remains, a big part of serving the Hispanic market. So can you talk a little bit about the messaging or sort of, the
The
mentality of how you should think about this group,
yeah, the
compared to maybe how we've
framing.
talked about it previously?
So, a couple of things can be true at the same time. A market can be underserved, unbanked, and low income, but at the same time, that same market can be growing, entrepreneurial, digital savvy, and, with a potential to grow their income. So, the way that we have been framing all of these underserved markets have been kind of like negatively. If you think about unbanked, that has a negative connotation. Underserved have a negative connotation. High risk, negative connotations, right? And we humans are conditioned not to work on problems, especially when we have no bandwidth. We don't really want to, solve one more problem. So psychologically, there's a barrier there when the narrative in a new market is like, oh, these are people that need our help, and it's so negative. If we
Mm,
frame this the other way, finding the positives, this
hmm
is a young, growing demographic. This is a digitally savvy demographic. This is a very entrepreneurial demographic. It's going to help us solve a lot of the issues that credit unions have, aging membership. What do we do with all these branches? We need the young Gen Z consumer now. Those are things that basically support those strategic issues that credit unions have with this consumer. So why don't we take away the deficit thinking of underserved, underbanked, high risk, and translate it into positives?
hmm
Still, both things are true, but
hmm
we are basically asking the team at the credit union to work on things that are going to help us grow, be
hmm
relevant, and be there 10, 15, 20 years from now,
hmm
rather than solve one more problem for, a constituency that probably doesn't deserve all these negative labels. And, this is legacy thinking that we have in the way that we have work on financial inclusion. We're here to help those that are underserved, those that are cut off from financial services. Still, that's true, but we need to characterize the market in a different light.
hmm Yeah, yeah. Again, this is just another example of like the conventional wisdom of this group of people. First we talked about sort of the demographic misconceptions that
Yeah,
many of us have, but now we're talking about the economic reality and the misconceptions that are associated with this group as well, in that they are, a much more economically well, diverse certainly, but
mm-hmm.
there's so much more economic opportunity, so much more, income, growth potential, and to your point, a digital savvy group that understands how to use these tools and wants
Right.
and they want to grow their personal financial lives, like, that I think, again, changing our mindset a little bit about this group in a few ways, I think is really important. And I would guess that most credit unions that haven't studied this closely or that haven't worked with you probably have, sort of the same kind of misconceptions that I've had. And I also know that you have invested recently in a sort of a
Hmm.
new tool that you help
Yeah.
credit unions with to sort of get to the heart of some of this data that we've been talking about. Can you share a little bit about that and talk about, how that can make an impact for credit unions?
Yeah. Well, the credit union, the Iowa Credit Union League, actually, through our holding company AMC, we purchased a data company, a data marketing company, and it's we are working right now with them to really add even more tools for the credit unions or for any client to actually appeal to consumers that need different things. We will have pretty shortly the ability to, let's say, one of the things that I see day in and day out, how our credit unions growing Hispanic membership is actually through indirect lending.
Mm-hmm.
A used car, a new car, but in a dealership.
Mm.
Through all these analytics and data analysis that we can do, we can find the ideal member that only has, let's say, an indirect loan. How can that member then add other services that the credit union offers, a savings account or a checking account or wealth management and all of these things, so it doesn't stay with only that one indirect loan, and 3 4 years from now they leave, they
Mm.
never realize the potential of their credit union membership. So now data can create this ideal member, and this ideal member can be actually reached by social media, by different ads, by billboards, by whatever that member is.
Mhm.
They could see the credit union messaging because now the data it's able to identify where they are, what is their email address, what is the IP address, and all of these things, so that the person knows, hey, there's a credit union out there and there's several products and services. So that kind of thing will be able to give it to credit unions pretty soon, and that
Mm.
is those are aimed for growth and actually to nudge those consumers to better financial health and habits. It's better to we can identify you have say $10,000 in a savings account that is making just 1%. Why don't you put this money in a CD? So things like that, or we notice that you have your credit score went down. What's going on? We have these classes here at the credit union that can help you improve your credit score. So
Mm.
things like that through analytics will be possible very, very soon. And
Mm.
it doesn't matter, your ethnicity or race. It's all the members that the credit union can serve. So
Mm.
that's coming up.
Okay. Oh, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. That sounds like a great
Hmm.
resource, great tool for sure. So just a couple more questions for you, two
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
So the second to last is, for a credit union who is, interested in working with you, who
Hmm.
understands that there is this opportunity in their market, when would you say they'd be ready to start working with you? And what are some of the signs that says, okay, they need your support.
Yeah.
Let's have a conversation.
Well, I will say, the country is growing more and more multicultural every day. There is every credit union that wants to kind of understand the multicultural growth and how to appeal to these different cultural markets.
Mhm.
They should be having some sort of curiosity around it. If
Mhm.
anything, just have the data available to them and see, 15 years from now, what is my community gonna look like? So anytime, and it doesn't matter if you're in South Dakota, North Dakota, or in El Paso, Texas,
Mhm.
every zip code is becoming more and more multicultural in the United States. So I would
Mhm.
say, the time is it's now to really understand this and to really target different identities, different cultural groups, different lived experiences within the market. We humans are highly complicated, and we need to know how to target or how to appeal to to all this complication.
Yes, yeah. I don't think a truer statement has ever been said, Victor. We humans are very, very complicated.
Yes.
Uh, if the last, several years hasn't taught us that by now, I don't know if we'll ever learn
Right.
that learn that truth
Right.
for sure. Okay, last question for you. I try to ask this
Yeah.
to most of our guests here at Credit
Yeah.
Union Nation, but I like to be optimistic. I like to
Yeah.
finish our conversations on a very optimistic note. So, what gives you the greatest hope and optimism about the credit union industry? What do you see as being sort of the shining, beautiful future that this credit union movement of ours is going to enjoy here?
Well, it's just the people like yourself that we work on this beautiful industry and having that cooperative business model that really is not a model of extraction, is it's a model of adding things to and improving things for a community. I think, having that commitment of improving lives, of removing barriers, and making sure that the consumer feels better. It's a very noble thing to work in. So that gives me the hope, and knowing that there's so many people committed, and that really the word is love working in this.
Hmm.
Sure, that really is a positive note, and something to give you purpose and meaning. Working in an industry that is adding things, not extracting things from our communities and our local places.
Yes, I love that. I really love that message. And I love you talking about that it's not extraction. That's something that
Hmm.
really resonates with me. I'm actually reading East of Eden by John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck's one of my favorite authors, and I feel like East of Eden is okay. Here's book review corner at Credit Union
Yeah.
Nation podcast. It's maybe not one of my favorites of his, but one of my absolute favorites obviously is Grapes of Wrath. And in that
Hmm.
book, there's a famous quote, and I can't do it word for word, but essentially,
Yeah.
there's a man that says, I wish that me making a living didn't mean taking from my neighbor or having to take from somebody else.
Right.
And I always feel so fortunate that's a line that resonates with me very, very much so. And
Hmm.
I always feel so fortunate that we work in an industry where that isn't the case, where doing
Right.
my banking at a credit union doesn't mean taking from someone. It actually means giving to someone, in
Right.
a certain sense, right? I mean, that's so special. The model, as you said, is something we should absolutely not take for granted, and that we should
Hmm.
all continue to fight to advance and make sure that it's relevant and sustainable long into the future. And so I
Correct.
appreciate your work doing that. And it's always a pleasure working with you, Victor, and talking to you. So glad we got to do this. Thank you so
Yeah.
much
Thank
for
you.
joining today. Really appreciate it.